Okay, time is 6:30. I'm going to call the Newcastle Planning Board meeting to order. The date is August 17th, 2023. Our second item on the agenda is to review the minutes from our June 20th, 2023 Planning Board meeting. Do I have a motion to accept the minutes? Moved. We have a second? Moved and seconded. Any discussion about the minutes, comments, anything you want to? I thought they looked great.
I was going to cover some stuff in the planner's report because we talked about a bunch of stuff, which I guess got bumped to the next meeting, but
Perfect.
it's not about the minutes.
All right. Like the format, everything looked great. Captured it without being too verbose.
That's my goal.
All right, seeing nothing else, all in favor of the minutes? That passes 4-0.
Lucas, I'm going to count you as abstain.
I wasn't there.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry.
That's
Right.
yeah.
All right, so we have no old business, new business. Review the proposed draft ordinance, historic special district review ordinance, and we have Isabel Exley. Did I say that right? I got it right. With us. Come on up. And also Tor Glendenning, who's the chair of that. Why don't you come up, Tor, too, and talk about it. So we all saw in the packet, Isabel's very nice memo to the planning board regarding the background of this project and the overview, and everybody had a chance to review that. And I have been on that committee working with them, part of the process. And we just had our, was that last week?
It was. Believe it or not. It
Oh my
was
God.
Tuesday.
A lot has happened. So, oh, you have a presentation?
Mhm.
Wonderful. Great. Take it away.
Yeah, so my presentation, so actually just for a little bit of background, as you all are aware, you all put forward the recommendation to create the ad hoc historic preservation committee. I think at our February meeting, our last meeting, together. And then I was retained by the town to continue working on that ordinance. So I've been working with the ad hoc committee since about February, going through that. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail in my presentation. But in general, what I'm planning to cover is just sort of a broad, what is historic preservation? How did we get here? And then we'll go through a more nitty-gritty overview of the draft ordinance, as well as just for your knowledge, next steps. And then I would love to get any questions or comments that you might have on the draft that was included in your packet. So in general, just for the purposes of this ordinance, historic preservation is a conversation about the past for the purposes of planning for the future. What that means in this case is that we will be identifying and regulating buildings, structures, sites, or districts with cultural, social, architectural, or historic value in order to communicate with future generations those places, including individual buildings or sites or whole neighborhoods, which have been important or significant to the broader story of the town of Newcastle, the way that it developed in the past and its inhabitants. That's kind of a broad definition, but in general, what it is for this ordinance is the regulation of certain buildings that you all had already talked about for the core zoning code. Just for a brief overview of how we got to this point. So throughout the development of the core zoning code, I'm told that historic preservation was discussed, but general consensus was not reached on how to actually tackle it. So it was decided that the SD historic zoning district boundaries captured what the community considered to be historic neighborhoods at that time. And then interim demolition delay standards were added, which is in Article 7, Section 22 of the existing core zoning code. I'm told that there was sort of general agreement that a future committee would be appointed to hold public meetings and discuss this topic in greater detail. And then when COVID happened, obviously a lot of initiatives were put off, including this one. So that was basically until earlier this year in February when, after our conversation about upcoming ordinance amendments, you all had put forward a recommendation to the select board to create the ad hoc committee. And at that time, a request for volunteers was posted at the town office and in the newspaper. And then the select board ended up appointing the ad hoc committee in late February. So actually, based on your recommendation, the group is comprised of one member of the planning board, which was Ben, a member of the select board, and one member from each of the 3 special historic districts. Tor was the representative from the select board and then was also subsequently elected chair. And then we also have Karen Paz, who is in this instance representing Damascotta Mills Historic District. And then we have Catherine Burke, who is representing Sheepscot Village, and Bonnie Stone, who is representing Glidden Street neighborhood. So since that time, the group has held 9 meetings and a public informational workshop. Our meetings were generally well attended by the impacted members of the public, usually with at least 2 or 3 people there. And the largest one, I think, was up to 20 something people. And then the public informational workshop had about 40 people present. And that was back in July. And then at this point, we're on draft 10 of the ordinance, which was renamed from a historic preservation ordinance to the historic special district review ordinance to better capture what it's intended to be reviewing. And at their last meeting, last Tuesday, the ad hoc committee unanimously voted to pass along to the planning board the draft ordinance that they'd come up with, including for your review, any questions, and then a public hearing when you see appropriate to do so. Just for your knowledge, the special historic districts are the purple color. So about where my cursor is on Sheepscot, and then Glidden Street area, and then Damascotta Mills. And I should note that that wasn't changed from the core zoning code map that was adopted in November of 2020. So that was the existing boundaries of the special historic districts. So just for a brief overview of the ordinance itself, it essentially establishes a historic preservation review board that would be tasked with reviewing certain designated projects. It essentially has established 3 levels of review, or 3 tiers of review, we're calling them. Tier 1 is a staff level administrative review by the town planner. Tier 2 is a review and public hearing at a meeting of the Historic Preservation Review Board. And Tier 3 is for larger, more complex projects than Tier 2, which may also require technical assistance by a hired consultant specializing in architectural history or historic preservation. But that would also be reviewed at a public hearing of the Historic Preservation Review Board. This is a long list of Tier 1 projects. That was important to the group. So a lot of the projects are things that can be reviewed at the staff level. And they include this broad list of sort of, lower level, less need for a public hearing projects, including the removal of materials that have no historical basis or that would create a false sense of historical development, replacement of architectural features that have no historical basis with ones that would, the installation of missing historical materials and features supported by documentation, repointing and other masonry repairs, construction or replacement of patios or decks where the majority of the patio cannot be seen from the public realm, the exterior placement of meters, vents, cable or telephone boxes, wiring, antennas, HVAC system components, etc., when not on the primary facade of the building. The addition, removal, or replacement of cloth, canvas, or acrylic awnings that would otherwise comply with relevant review standards. The removal of deteriorated accessory buildings not original to the site or otherwise historically significant. Installation of temporary structures, especially for ADA access. The installation of fences or low walls of wood, stone, or brick, unless proposed in the frontage zone of the lot, which would kick it up to a public hearing. and then the replacement of exterior light fixtures and the installation of new light fixtures. And then as we sort of keep going through the tiers of review, the second tier is ones that would require a public hearing with the review board. That's the replacement of architectural details when there will be a change in design or materials from the original. The installation of fences or low walls of wood when actually proposed to be in the frontage zone of the lot. The installation of renewable energy systems, which also includes solar panels, and that then changes to roof lines like rooftop additions or dormers or rooftop decks. And then finally, the tier 3 review board projects that may require escrow by the applicant for a consultant to assist in review is any new construction occurring within the historic special districts, demolitions of any part of any structure, the discovery of any archaeological resource on a site would automatically kick it up into this tier. Moving of buildings, which is sort of captured under demolition, and then any new additional structures as defined in the core zoning code. So in general, all projects, regardless of who reviews them, would be subject to the standards as outlined in the ordinance. And there are, as you probably saw, standards for alterations and additions, demolitions and relocations, new construction and additions, and then a set of special standards specific to renewable energy systems. And then just for your knowledge of how we kind of got to this point, in general, all of the standards were based on the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties. It's a category called rehabilitation. There's actually 4 categories. Rehabilitation is typically considered sort of middle ground for their standards, and it's defined as the act or process of making possible compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which actually convey its historic, cultural, or architectural values. This was a purposeful choice to base these standards off of the federal government's standards. They're also the standards that are used for reviewing of historic tax credit projects at both the state and federal level. And so in general, our standards were based on that to allow some leeway for changes, but also to make sure that we were capturing and regulating appropriately the portions that are actually historical. The ordinance itself also outlines a process for expanding or adding to the existing historic districts. This process essentially, well, actually it does follow that outlined in the core zoning code, but it adds a little review at the beginning with the Historic Preservation Review Board. So they would provide a review and recommendation, and then it would go through the typical zoning amendment process through the planning board and then ultimately to town meetings. Similarly, it outlines a voluntary process for establishing local landmarks. These are one-off buildings that might be outside of historic districts, but which still add to the overall architectural, cultural, or historic character of Newcastle. Local landmarks would follow the same process as adding or expanding historic districts. So a review and recommendation with the Historic Preservation Review Board, any studies that might be available, and then would go through the planning board, select board, and ultimately town meeting vote. This one is, just to provide some context, actually something that was requested at the outset of this process. So when it was posted in the newspaper that we were recruiting people, I started to get some phone calls from folks who live in the districts who were interested, or actually folks who live just outside of the districts who were interested in finding a way to preserve their buildings that are not within the historic district. And we know that there are some buildings that are not in the existing boundaries of the historic districts, but that are probably older, culturally significant to the community, and would also potentially benefit from some review. And we heard from some of those property owners and outlined this process for them. And then in terms of next steps, just for your knowledge, The next step in any zoning amendment process is for a public hearing with the planning board to be scheduled. So you all will have to hold your own public hearing. And then any changes that need to be made as a result of that hearing will be made. It has to be a noticed public hearing in accordance with state statutes. A public hearing with the select board would be required after that, and then it would be added to, we're thinking, a special town meeting warrant. I want to add a caveat here that I did note in my memo to you all that we were hoping for a scheduling of a public hearing for your next regular meeting, which is on September 21st. There are some legal questions that have come up in regard to this ordinance, and it is still pending legal review as of maybe an hour ago.
Just got it.
Perfect. So we haven't had a chance to resolve those outstanding sort of more legal questions. And so at this point, we would just recommend, I'm here to answer any questions that you have, take any comments. The ad hoc committee has another meeting scheduled early in September, and they'll make any changes that are requested, or at least discuss your changes. And then we will kind of go from there in terms of scheduling another a public hearing with you all and noticing that. I think that's all I have. Thanks for bearing with me. Like I said, if you have any questions or general comments, I'm happy to answer them or go through anything in additional detail.
Thank you. So this is all not news to me, so I want to leave enough space for those of you who have not been intimately involved with the process to ask questions or get clarifications or anything you like.
I had a question, comment. Under the article, section E4, or the first part, E4,
Yep.
talks about appeals. And that if it's an appeal from the board that's created, it goes to the Board of Appeals.
Mhm.
But if it's an appeal from the town planner, it would go back to the review board.
Mhm.
And I'm just curious why everything isn't going to the Board of Appeals, because my understanding under the code is the Board of Appeals is the vehicle for that. So.
That's a good question. In terms of ordinances that have staff level review, it's typical that any decisions of the staff, rather than going straight to the Board of Appeals, are able to be, for lack of a better term, like adjudicated with the actual reviewing body before it goes to the Board of Appeals. So that's typical of most ordinances with like a staff review. Yeah.
I got a question.
Go for it.
I was just wondering if the board was aware of the, just sort of the document drafts sort of process that was posted on the website. So if you are curious to know the process that the committee went through, Isabel did a very thorough process of taking notes of all the questions that were asked, sort of requests by the public, and then requests by the committee itself, documented, and then she responded with answers to those that we could bring forth to the next meeting, address those comments, and then take action, make changes to the document. And so there's a nice, very, very thorough history of those 9 meetings and the presentation on the website. So if you haven't had a chance, it's a lot. I'm just saying, if you're ever curious on knowing sort of the process, it's all there. And the benefit too to the town is anybody that has a question on how we got here, they have that access as well. So,
On the committee page on the website.
yeah.
Including some extensive conversations with residents who came to meetings, and also the informational meeting that was held at the Lincoln Academy Dining Hall. did you have comments or
Yeah,
either of you? Doesn't matter. I'm,
yeah.
I don't, no, you're good? Yeah. Michael, do you have anything you want to?
I did. I had a few concerns actually that I voiced to the town manager. And I spoke with Isabel a little bit and Tor as well. And so I would say most of my concerns revolve around the lack of clarity and standards. Typically, when you're writing an ordinance and you're doing a review, it's appropriate to have clear, firm standards that are objective. A lot of the standards in this are kind of unobjective. They're subjective, and it worries me both in terms of assisting residents and trying to navigate this, but also in defending any decision by anybody that comes to a decision, because what one person interprets as visually compatible or things like that really haven't been kind of nailed down, so to speak. So and it kind of falls into two categories. One is some of the actual terms that are in there which haven't really been defined, or phrases that come up that aren't defined. And then some of it is also just lacking kind of clear metrics about relationships between buildings. We're talking proximity, if we're talking density or anything like that. So that was a concern of mine. There were some issues in kind of process that I noticed. I know that I had a question about one, which isn't really a huge issue, about making an amendment to or adding these individual parcels. It sounds, I think what you said just now is those go to town meeting. So for individual properties.
Yep, any change to zoning has to go.
Yeah. That was exactly my question. So I don't know, have you given any thought to adding individual properties, and any concern about whether or not it's an kind of appropriate action to take by basically spot zoning, for lack of a better term?
This is, so Michael, this is in reference to the landmark.
That
section.
specifically is, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a concern, because again, these issues kind of cut both ways, where the issues with spot zoning come up when you're either kind of singling out a property owner who, unlikely in this case, doesn't want to be singled out, and you're kind of taking away some of their rights, or conferring benefit to a single property owner, at the in an unfair way. So those are the two things that usually come up as issues when you're singling out single properties. There was come up a couple other things, but I know I mentioned to you, Isabel, about like staggering terms and just putting in their definitions about identifying the initial terms. If you're going to have staggered terms, somebody's going to have to serve 1 year, somebody's going to have to serve 2, and then you can get to the 3 years going forward. I noticed there wasn't a whole lot of, there was some language about the board attaching conditions to approvals that seemed broad, and I'm not sure. I think it might suggest that the board kind of has limitless discretion in adding conditions, which I would suggest is not the case. Yeah, and some other minor things we talked about. I would love if the requirement for this board to meet once a month was maybe a bit more flexible, since the numbers that you pulled, I think it was maybe 4 applications a year came up that would even fall under this ordinance. So meeting monthly might be excessive.
Mhm.
So there were you know, there's that. I've gone through it plenty, but I haven't really gone through and done a line by line and say, oh, this is because I'm hoping that some of these things we can maybe are addressable, you know, maybe in kind of broad chunks.
Yeah.
So,
I guess, and so in terms of the question around spot zoning, obviously, like I mentioned, this is under legal review currently, and that's one of the questions that came up, you know, that we're aware of. In general, typically when courts are going, I'm not an attorney, let me just specify. I'm not an attorney, so I will trust the town's attorney on this matter, but in general, when courts are going to determine whether a zoning amendment, which this would be in this case, constitutes like spot zoning, a reviewing court would probably consider a number of factors like the size of the area to be rezoned, the classification and development of adjacent land, relationship of the amendment to existing zoning patterns and previous objectives like outlined in the comp plan, and then the planning history of the amendment, any benefits or detriments which might accrue to the owner of the land and the neighbors and the community. So like you mentioned, like, is it exclusive for the landowner making the request with absolutely no relation to the community? There was a case in my hometown of Old Town that kind of weighed in on this. That's in Maine Municipal Association's manual for planning boards, where basically the court found that spot zoning reclassified land to create a small commercial area entirely surrounded by residential use. And the court found that that amendment was to be of a benefit to a specific landowner without any relation to the welfare of the neighborhood or the community at large. In this case, the argument would be that historic preservation is a larger benefit to the community and isn't just impacting one property owner. So that's sort of, we haven't had specific discussions around spot zoning as an issue generally. That was sort of the thought process going into this, was that this is a larger benefit, and that's why it's important to have the ability for properties outside of the existing historic district. So anyway, I would welcome any comments from the town's attorney on that, but I think that's sort of thought process.
was that discussed with the ad hoc committee?
We had an extensive discussion about the local landmarks, but like I said, we didn't have a discussion about spot zoning in particular, or
Yeah, not the legal aspects of it.
yeah.
Just to explain a little bit about the intent of that sort of whole section of the ordinance was derived from the idea that the three zones, three special historic zones that we're talking about, were delineated during the time of the core zoning sort of process. And so we had to draw the lines, town had to draw the lines somewhere. Whereas, you know, the previous version of this which was design review ordinance, was a very broad brush across many sort of parts of town. So the thought was, well, we're going to lose some of those assets in those districts that would otherwise be sort of, you know, it would be good to know, you know, how they're being treated as far as, you know, process of development. For example, the Newcastle Square building, which is not in the district, very, you know, it's on the registry, it's a historic asset to the town. Everybody recognized it would be devastating if somebody decided to raise that and put up some other building. So example, Second Congo Church, St. Patrick's, you know, the Francis Perkins Center, which is now a landmark nationally. So just as a few examples, it was to recognize that those properties, and then there were some other residences, resident owners that have very old houses that wanted to actually be included in this under this ordinance, but they were 2 or 3 properties removed from the district. So the idea was, what's a mechanism in order to adopt these structures, not necessarily the property, into the ordinance, so that in the future, if there's some kind of grant program or some kind of process that the town is going to go through respective to the preservation ordinance, that it would capture these sort of outlying properties. So this was it was discussed by the committee how to do this. This was the answer to that. So, you know, it was sort of pushed back, I would say, by the residents that you got to be very clear that this is not something that somebody can say, Peter, your house is going to be historic preservation property. I'm going to vote that Peter's house goes into this ordinance and you're going to be subjected to tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And that's not the intent. It was the intent to say an owner has the right to ask the town to be adopted into it. And then it would go through the process of the preservation board to see if it's acceptable. So that's kind of the process, not to allow, you know, just kind of random, you know, random advocation for somebody's house that wants to be in. So.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of legal questions that that we can consider, that you raised, that we're happy to consider. And then obviously the administrative stuff is pretty low hanging fruit that we can discuss at our next meeting. So I think, yeah, in terms of the planning board, I had written in my memo that my recommendation would be to schedule a public hearing for September 21st, which is your next regular meeting. In general, probably putting that off until we have clear legal guidance on some of the outstanding questions would be great.
Just two of the little sort of low hanging fruit, Michael, on your list. I think one is the adoption of the committee or how that gets turned in. You know, I think it's pretty easy paragraph to kind of say, you know, there's everybody has got a 1, 2, or 3, or 5 year term. And then it kind of gets sort of, you know, as somebody comes up in the first year, they can either renew, you know, term up again for a 2-year term. So I think it's going to take about 4 or 5 years before there's consistency and the terms kind of just become standard routine. But I think that's a pretty easy paragraph. The thing with the, I think your question about whether once a month is too much for a board. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the board wants to meet every month without anything to review. The experience that I had with design review committee, which was if we had an application, let me back up. The thing that became an issue when we first started, where I first got on the board or the committee, which was an application would come in, we'd get a call, we'd have to advertise in the paper, set up a meeting date, coordinate between 5 people, what's the date that works. So before there was even Google poll, you couldn't even, you just have to do it through email. Come to a date, which may be 2 weeks or maybe a month later, and then organize that date, you know, with the applicant that can make the date, and then get the material. So anyway, it was cumbersome. So after about a year or 2 in the process, I said, well, let's do this. Let's just have, just like planning board, first Thursday of the month or first, second Thursday, whatever it was. That's the date for design review committee. Your material has to be in 2 weeks prior. So that's the deadline. And then you have a chance for the board to review it. If there's no applications, you just don't meet. And so it worked pretty well because then people could organize, you know, vacation time. They knew if they're going to be there. We knew if we had a quorum. But in the case where there's 4 applications a year, yeah, it doesn't make sense to meet 12 times. So,
Yeah. That's, I guess my reading of that was the language was a little inflexible.
Yeah.
Like it will meet.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
So I don't think that it's my concern is then what happens if, you know, there is nothing on the agenda and the municipal, you know, the board doesn't meet that.
Yeah.
Switch. It probably should just, I'm sure we can just lift the language from the
Clarify.
core zoning code and just use that, but.
I think your other point about the standards that you raised, I mean, they're great questions. I think if there's a definition that can clarify that, I think that would be great. And I think it just needs to be added into the document. I mean, I think some of it though, it's hard to define. I mean, it's hard to define what character is, but character is very much a part of any kind of expression of architecture. So it's one of those things. I don't know if you can write a book about what character is. I don't know if you'd still be able to define it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, do you take it out completely? I think then you're losing a tool for a board or a group of people to discuss something. So it's a great question. It's a philosophical question as far as I'm concerned, but I don't, it's kind of where I jump off.
I totally understand.
Yeah.
And I think this is what the challenge with planning is. If you don't set clear standards, it's very hard to work with. It's hard for residents to understand what is allowed. It's hard for a board to decide what is allowed because there's not really any guidance there to say, are we talking about X, Y, or Z? It's also hard then for anybody to kind of defend the decision. And this is, I think, is the thing that is I like to stress to anybody who's creating ordinances and when you're talking to towns is that your decisions are only really backstopped by the ordinance, and you can't just make kind of arbitrary distinctions. And the standards should be set in an ordinance, and the purpose of the board is then to determine if the standard's been met or not.
Mhm.
And a lot of the language in here seems to leave the standard making up to the meeting and to kind of shift around depending on an application, which I would suggest is a recipe for trouble, because it's hard to say whether, if you can't say what the standard is, or if you're redefining it every meeting, then you can't really defend, or you can't be consistent or objective in your application. So that's my concern with that. I think actually it's interesting. I think that the current core zoning code provides a pretty good framework for addressing some of like the design and physical issues that communities struggle to kind of regulate by addressing, by hitting them kind of head on. And so I wonder if maybe there's a missed opportunity to use the core zoning code to better define what some of these standards are, some of the things that you're talking about, because character can be very, it can apply to, I mean, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I think that's, which is troubling, it makes conversations hard. So.
So again, my experience on design review for years was basically challenged with this very question every time we had an applicant. And so it was not to define character, but it was the conversation about basically what's appropriate in this situation. And so I think the discourse in the committee, in the committee's meeting, was not so much what does the definition say here, whether it's Webster's dictionary or the ordinance or some other code, what is character. It became just a part of conversation, and the applicant was part of that. It was part of that discussion. So it became a dialogue between the applicant and the board, actually, not just the board defining what it is. So there's a lot of interaction, I think, and it's very fine grained when you get into the nuance of whatever you're doing. I mean, sometimes you're talking about, what's the correct, a typical one is what's the correct window pattern for this period of house. Is it 2/2 or is it 6/6? What's the character of a federal, of a Greek revival built in 1850? So those are things I think you can kind of define, but, that's a discussion, I think, using the word character is part of um, part of that sort of process. That's a dialogue, I think. So,
So
um, yeah, go ahead. No, I mean, I think that's basically it. Um, I never had an instance where somebody said, it says that rhythm and void is here. My house has got rhythm and void, and you're saying rhythm so it never came down to a discussion of what is rhythm and void mean. And to be honest, when we got into it with the committee, nobody knew what rhythm and void meant. It's like, what are we talking about here, guys? So I think those things were, again, those are kind of design talk. I mean, it's stuff that architects use, it's planners use. But it's just a sort of, I guess, a framework for discussion, but it doesn't become the legal point of discussion.
In terms of like the process of how we got here, I think I need to give a little bit more of a primer, I guess, of to how we got to this point. So I referenced in my presentation that the standards were drawn from the Secretary of the Interior's standards around rehabilitation, which is used for state and federal tax credits. In addition, the committee at the outset in our early meetings in February and early March had a pretty extensive discussion around whether or not we wanted to be part of the state Historic Preservation Office's certified local government program, which is a program for municipalities to be a part of that allows, if you have a ordinance adopted according to their guidelines that they put out, allows a municipality to be eligible for training for their review boards, and then also grant funds, like significant grant funds for planning projects and preservation projects, and also can offset the cost of staffing for the people that review the ordinance, review projects according to the ordinance. So we had kind of extensive discussion around whether we should make this like a chapter of the core zoning code, or whether this should be a module separate from the core zoning code, and should it meet with the CLG guidelines. Ultimately, the direction that I got from the committee and sort of how we've landed at this point is that we should draft an ordinance that meets the needs of Newcastle. And if it also meets the CLG guidelines, that would be ideal. So we started essentially with their model ordinance from the state and worked from there, melding it with the core zoning code and the needs of, as expressed by the residents at our meetings and by the ad hoc committee itself. So that's kind of how we got to this point. My contract with the town also includes hours to create a design guidelines manual. Essentially, how other towns have tackled that and across other states is that they'll take the standard and then they'll kind of describe how it's implemented, so that residents can look at the design guidelines manual and say, okay, well, this is telling me that I have that because, I'm part of the 3 capes in a row on Glidden Street, that I should attempt to generally match that height and that width and use these kinds of windows and et cetera. So that would be the intent of the design guidelines manual that's forthcoming as well. So that'll be sort of a companion to this that residents and the review board can utilize as a resource in reviewing applications. But and I got this question from the residents, so I want to be clear though that the only reviewing standard is the standards outlined in the code, in the ordinance itself. So the design guidelines would be a compendium to sort of help people through the process, but they would need to demonstrate compliance with the standards. So if there's, and we did discuss at one point not to throw Ben under the bus, but I think it was probably Ben that asked for like specific percentages or numbers around. I'm using height and width as an example a lot. That was a significant one that we talked about. And at one point we did have some more specific numbers in there. And ultimately the remainder of the committee decided that it was better to keep the standards a little bit broader because of the variety that we have in our historic districts. So as we started to actually do case studies and Google Street View of the properties within the historic districts, they're all vastly different. So ultimately, it was sort of the idea or the vision to give applicants the ability to assess their specific property according to the standards that we've drafted for them, and then design something that would meet those standards while keeping those standards specific enough to convey what we were expecting from them, but broad enough that it could apply across all 3 historic districts. Sort of a interesting dilemma, but this is where we've landed. And then if there are specific comments around standards, obviously we can address those as well.
Yeah, I think just to let you know kind of where we are with this, the committee. So the committee still exists. We're ready for action to get back together if we have to, address some of these edits, I'll say. So I think, we got to a point at our last meeting, which was last week. And after our 9th meeting, we said, as a committee, we felt like we had gone through a really thorough process of creating a document, which was our charge to begin with. We felt like we worked well as a committee. We had a very competent consultant to help us through that process. And the committee felt that we had also heard and addressed the the comments of the residents and tried to make their comments put to action. So the committee said, I think this is good. It's basically as good as it's going to get. There's always a chance in the future to make amendments, but you could carry this on for years and you'd still wouldn't have a perfect document. So at this point, let's give it to the planning board for their review, and we'll let them carry it forward from there. I think, the hearing should be at a pace that's comfortable for the board to, to have time to review and feel comfortable with the document. And, I think that's where we're at. We're just, we'll be on hold until, we get sort of have to have another meeting. So.
Did you have a model ordinance? You mentioned a model ordinance. Is there a model ordinance from the state that you
Yeah.
have?
There are a bunch on their website that we were working off of.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. So it wasn't just like one model?
No.
No. Okay, because I was looking through the certified local government document, and I'm there's a lot of really good policies in there, but the actual converting it into ordinance, I have some concerns about how that was done or whether that was done. And you mentioned the tax credits, and the concern that I have is that standards for tax credits are a very different standard, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing where people are applying. You can tell them whatever they want, because if they don't meet your standards, you tell them to go away. They haven't lost anything. But I want to make sure that we're not kind of using that same standard here, because it's a very kind of different issue. So
Yeah, I'm actually been involved with 2 projects going through the Department of Interior's HTC program. It's a very detailed, laborious process. I don't think that's what we were saying, that the town would provide a tax credit for anything. The historic tax credit would have to come from federal or state money.
And I just want to make sure we're not asking the same thing of residents that, that would qualify them for a tax credit, that they could have much stricter standards than I think would be appropriate for municipalities, is more my point.
Yeah.
There's just different tools to get at different things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But yeah, I will leave my comments there. I think it's an admirable goal that the town, especially town as old as Newcastle, is targeting here. It's interesting how this ordinance goes about it.
Excuse me. Great conversation. That was wonderful. Two things. One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, that I just wanted to mention, was that throughout the process, and I can't remember how early it was in the meetings, the committee did have a lot of conversation around the idea, or around the knowledge that the composition of the review committee would not be experts, and that it might be desirable to have, I'm sitting in a planning board meeting with two planners for the first time in, does anyone remember when that happened
The word is
in Newcastle? Forever.
Yeah.
It's like never, right? So like we're stepping up our game, which is awesome. It's wonderful. But to have that type of professional services on hand to render opinions to the amateurs who are either elected or appointed, it has value. And Newcastle has recognized that and been making movement toward having greater professional services in the town, specifically for that reason. And so we talked about that on the committee a lot and said, is there some way we can incorporate that? Can we bring in an historian or architect historian, or somebody? There's lists out there of people who do these sort of things, restoration specialists or whatever the case may be, and have either the list available or pay someone to advise the committee. And so that idea was tossed around a lot. It was incorporated into the draft at one point, in the form of, if what you were doing was rising to the level of, like tier 3 review where it's extensive, that maybe it would be appropriate to request the applicant to escrow some funds to help pay for that type of review from a professional service to help the review board, so that person can come in and could say, in 1850, in this style of house, this was common. That was not, and help provide the guidance. My sort of, as that concept has unfolded throughout the document and through public discussion, got a lot of negative pushback. And there was just not, maybe it just wasn't understood by the community the way that we were trying to express it, or maybe it was just seen as, it was, I guess, seen as just another thing, another burden that applicants would have to bear in order to get their application through the process, and they didn't really want it and they weren't very interested in it. And so that has been toned down a lot, or almost completely taken out at this point. So I just wanted to mention that. There was a lot of discussion about it. For what it's worth, I guess. And the second thing, as we were talking about this, I'm listening, and I just want to go back to the zoning question, which I love that thought that the proposal to create the landmarks could be construed as spot zone. I love it because I hadn't thought of it. And so I was just doing a quick sort of analysis of our zoning just to see. So we've got core zones, core districts, and we've got special districts. And I wanted to say, even though it's not defined in the actual ordinance, which is a little bit of an oversight, and we should clarify why we actually have core districts and special districts. And they're not just all just districts. So that is something that should be done, but my general understanding of the difference between a core district and a special district is continuity, roughly. Core districts are more or less contiguous in nature and form. They encompass an area or a neighborhood that has similar characteristics, and you don't see you don't see it all over the map. Do you know what I mean? It's generally in a very specific bubble of geographic area. Whereas a special district can be kind of all over the place. And that's, if you look at the 8 special districts we have: campus, marine, highway, commercial, rural, highway, fabrication, civic, conservation, and historic, they more than not are definitely sort of like pick a parcel here, pick a parcel there, pick a parcel there. It's individual lots, sometimes conservation specifically, and civic, small districts, but even the rural highway is, which looks more or less contiguous, is not. It's got outliers and everything like that. So I guess and it was a bad thing to do from my own assumption, I hadn't thought that it would be a legal challengeable thing to say, if you wanted to go through the zoning amendment process and change the color of a lot through the process we've already got defined as a special district, you could do that without any trouble. Am I explaining that correctly, or am I not?
Well, I'm not sure, but I want to just reflect on a question that was presented at the preservation, and this was a citizen, a resident that was concerned that there's a way to amend the zoning, and I think they were confused with the differences.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is confusing because there's the process to rezone that property under a zoning amendment through the core zoning code process, which is different than the landmark, which is through the what are we calling it? Which we had an acronym, through the preservation ordinance, for better term. So yeah, I think it's confusing. And I think that's what you're kind of getting at, but I think yeah, but again, how do you address an outlying structure or property, not necessarily a structure, that is eligible to be under a special sort of view by the town? I don't know.
It's a tricky one.
Yeah, no surveys were mentioned about, that adopting this might enable funding to do a survey.
Yeah.
And I think that is would be a really good, because one of the things I'm thinking about is, it sounds like what the landmarks issue is getting at is that there's historic value in properties kind of all over the municipality.
Mhm.
And so identifying that could be really valuable.
Mhm.
At the one meeting that I was at with the ad hoc committee, the terms came up, and I was saying there's contributing, defining, and non-contributing. And I've just seen that used with surveys that then kind of say like the defining are usually the ones that get a lot of attention, and the contributing are more, where you're kind of talking about district-wide things, relationship between buildings rather than like features of the buildings.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know where that goes from there. We do a survey, but That's, one way to address the kind of non-point nature of historic assets.
Yeah, I think one question, I mean, a big question is, what's the benefit? Right? What's the benefit to something being designated a special landmark in town? I mean, what does that do for me if I want to say my house was built in 1810? I think it's a landmark, and I want to petition the preservation board to have that adopted. I don't know. That's great. It would give me maybe a plaque on the wall, but what is the true benefit of that? I don't think that's really understood. So it would help, I think, the cause actually, if you knew what there was, what the action reaction was, I guess. But I mean, there is money available to these types of structures and properties. So, if you're eligible for some grant money, maybe it's just that.
I think we had talked about this, the carrot and stick more
Yeah.
together, I mean, zoning tends to be more, stick is, there's regulations that you have to follow, but having carrots too, that kind of incentivize a homeowner, and it sounds like there are plenty of residents who want to protect not just the historic character of the town, but also of their property, to figure out how to help offset some of the burden that can be associated with preserving historic property.
When you leave here and you go back downtown tonight, the houses and buildings that line the street, most of them are historic in nature, and they create a district that's very special. It's not our special historic district because not every building is pre-1900, so it's a diluted district. However, there's some very special buildings on this very street. If those became part of a broader preservation ordinance, I don't think that would be a bad thing. I think it would just help the historic preservation for the town as a whole. If somebody across the street says, I want to pass this on as a legacy to future homeowners of this building after I move away, and that's what I'm going to leave it with. Just as much as somebody would put conservation easement on their waterfront property before they pass on or they move, to say this should be preserved as a Canada Goose property, and this is it, and conserve it as that. So that decision is up to the property owner, and everybody has that right.
So
That's something I'm not as familiar with, but Isabel,
Yeah.
maybe like what individual property owners can do to kind of, on their own, that municipalities can't get at.
Mhm.
I just wanted to say that I just reviewed the establishment of historic special districts for local landmarks, which follow the same process.
Yeah.
Same purpose, same applicability. And I just wanted to make sure that I was absolutely correct here. That the reality of what this does, just so we're all totally clear here, is it makes it harder, much harder to move a parcel that is not currently in the special historic district into the special historic district. Because it adds another layer. You have to do a study, has to be a recommendation. The Maine Historic Preservation has to be involved. That recommendation has to come back, go to public hearing, several public hearings. And then after all of that, a final report is generated by the review board, sent to the planning board, and then it goes through the core zoning code zoning amendment process. So even if you wanted to become a local landmark, you ultimately have to go to the town, go through all that process, and then come to the town, and the whole town has to vote whether or not you voluntarily started this action. The town will accept your property in the special historic district.
Yeah.
Just so we're all clear.
Yep.
Did I make that too wordy?
And I think, while I agree with your sentiment, I think that the consideration was because there is value in actually studying and having a full understanding of what is being added and added to the historic special district or added as a local landmark.
I don't disagree. I just, there's multiple perspectives that we've heard throughout the process.
Yep.
And the majority of the perspective that we heard from the residents was concerned that the town or somebody, not them, could make their property in the district. Like I could just say, hey, I'm going to make your property and you don't get any say. I'm going to put it in the special historic district and because I don't like you. And
it's done in
it's
15 minutes.
it's done in 15 minutes with no public hearings
Right.
and no vote. And so, you know, I think I get just to hammer it home that it makes it much harder. Like if we were just following the core zoning code zoning amendment process that's already in the core zoning code, the planning board could just go, hey, I think this property should be in this district. Let's put that in front of the town. Next special meeting, it's in front of the town. Done. Like, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So this makes it much harder to actually put something into that district.
I would agree.
Maybe helping ease some mind.
I want to make sure I answered everybody's questions or concern, or at least have documented your concerns well enough. Any other comments or questions? Mhm.
The other thing I would just say is under section C qualifications, I would strike that entirely. I mean, obviously for a historic preservation board, you want people who are interested in historic preservation, but I think like the planning board just says it's residents of the town of Newcastle. And that's it. I think if someone wants to have a conversation with the town manager or the select board about why they want to join, I think those interests are very valid, but I just have a feeling that's not a good idea to put it in the ordinance, that being able to follow the ordinance, work with the town planner, to me, that's a lot more important than having an interest. And it's just kind of vague that, you know, someone may have gone to college and have a, you know, degree in American history. I did that and I currently work as a high school math teacher. So I really, I mean, a lot of people have history degrees. So I just think that should be clarified. So. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Yep.
At one point, we had been playing with the idea of actually doing applications,
Resumes.
resumes, and that was quickly changed.
And I'm just gonna take the opportunity again to kind of talk about another sort of kind of misconceived idea is that I think there's this idea perhaps from some residents that the committee would just be like, I don't know, maybe somebody that just shows up and wants to be on a board on this thing because they have an issue and they have some agenda. But there's a process to, it's like any other board or committee we have in town. There's a process to it and there's an appointment process to it. So it's not just show up and you're accepted. You have to be acknowledged, discussed, and appointed by at least a select board to be on any committee. So.
So it doesn't actually say here. Doesn't actually say here that the Historic Preservation Review Board would be a standing board. It should say that. If that's the intent. If it's not the intent, then it should be a. I think it was envisioned that the Historic Preservation Review Board would be a standalone board, not a committee of either
Yeah.
the select board or the planning board. It would
Yeah,
be
yeah.
independent.
And
But in order to not be considered an ad hoc, it needs to say
Mhm.
a standing board. I'm right about that, am I not?
I mean, what you're saying makes sense.
You're not right, but the words
No, no,
coming out of your
no.
mouth are English.
I would err on the side of defining it,
Right.
and stating it clearly. Was your concern was that it might be considered part of another board, or that
Well, if it
it would
doesn't
almost
say,
have to be reestablished every time?
yeah, if it doesn't say, it should just say,
Mhm.
shouldn't be a question.
To Lee's question about the, I think was the language about, the requirement for each district. I think we could say preferred. Maybe to ease that a little bit.
Yeah, preference should be given to
Yeah.
fill.
So, does anyone have anything else they want to discuss about the meat and potatoes? Or do we want to talk about process at this point?
Yeah, your process.
Process. So at the moment, we have to have public hearing at our regularly scheduled planning board meeting.
Yeah, the core zoning code actually specifies that it's a regularly scheduled.
Regularly scheduled.
Yep.
Can't be a non-regularly scheduled. Would you make a note to please change that in the core zoning code? Because that is too restrictive. So that means that if we are so inclined, then we would, I'm trying to get my calendar here, and this is a brand new computer. What is the date?
17.
No, in September.
So the September is September
21st.
21st. Yep.
Regular meeting.
21st is the regular meeting. So if we're inclined to hold a public hearing at that point, we would need to make that motion, make that action now. The other course of action is to
Mm,
go ahead.
Consider, you could say, schedule a public hearing, but not specify the date. So that we could, work with the town attorney, and I can work with Michael about scheduling an upcoming meeting according to noticing requirements from the state statute,
Mhm.
whether that's a September or a following meeting.
But at the moment, it would have to be either September or October. And
Yeah,
because we're locked
yeah, until,
until such time.
I don't
as-
think I want to wait to go to town meeting to
Yeah.
change that to then deal with this.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm at this point, I think the next logical thing to do is to send it to public hearing. And see what we get. We don't want to plan beyond that. We shouldn't plan beyond that. Yes, no?
Talking about the September 21st meeting.
Yes.
We'll be here.
Yeah. Okay. Michael, what do you think?
I think that works.
Okay. So do we have a motion then to get moved Seconded. Let me finish the motion before we move it. Move to send the submitted historic special district review ordinance from the historic committee to public hearing of the planning board on September 21st, 6:30 PM. Thank you very much. Thank you. Any further discussion about that? All in favor? All right, 4-0. We'll move it forward.
Motion?
Motion second.
Second.
Shoot. I locked it and you didn't want me to lock it.
Well.
To the 21st.
Um,
You think it's gonna take more time because of the notice.
we need to have it available 14 days in advance of a meeting, and the ad hoc committee's next meeting is not until that date, 14 days in advance.
So in theory, what you're actually saying is that there's no way it can actually be on the public hearing on the 21st.
And
Oh.
if you are anticipating amendments,
I mean, could suggest we could try to work with the committee to try to move up that date. I can't remember how we arrived at that date, whether it was difficult or not, but it seems far enough out at this point that we could move it up.
Yep.
I think we were trying to avoid, the first week of school, kind of that kind of rigmarole. So I think maybe we're trying to avoid that, but I don't know. It's,
I don't think there's necessarily an issue with I don't think that there's necessarily an issue with moving scheduling around on the committee's end.
that's right.
So the draft would have to be locked
By the September 7th,
by September 7th.
yes.
And based on just the discussion we've had tonight, there's already minor edits and changes that are gonna have to be made. Legal weighed in on some stuff. And the committee may have changes, you're saying?
Well, I don't think it's gonna be generated by the committee necessarily. It's gonna be a response to
The comments raised here.
comments raised.
Okay, then we'll keep it. Okay. So that's already done. Great. Gotta find my agenda. I think that was it. Was it not?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Thank everybody.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I hope people get to see it online and that was great. Good conversation. All right, next on the agenda, other business, 5A, planners report.
Okay, so when I was going through pulling the minutes together, there was a number of things that at our last meeting wanted to discuss. Bumped it for this conversation.
Yeah.
So TIF presentation, probably not going to have that at the next meeting either, I guess.
Okay.
But I'm pulling that together, just information so that we can discuss it and
Yeah.
just kind of not to propose it or anything like that, just to understand what it is so we can consider
a little more.
proposing. The Ben and Tor and I met with Kevin, the interim town manager. Was this week, I guess.
Yes. It was.
To discuss the work with the state about Main Street. To do, I
Wednesday.
guess,
That was Wednesday morning.
Wednesday. There's gonna be a whole process there, but that's something that I'm working on with the town. Redesign and figuring out how to improve mainly the bad intersection, which if you hadn't already guessed is what's in front of the Newcastle Public House, and then also what's in front of where the on-off ramp meets River Road, Main Street.
So just so that everybody knows, because maybe everyone doesn't know, the town has applied for a village Partnership Initiative. Is that what it's called? VPI, Village Partnership Initiative.
There's
The DOT
that.
has a program.
And planning partnership initiative.
Right, grant planning. The DOT has these programs to basically work with municipalities on infrastructure projects relating to transportation, basically. And last year, they rolled out this village partnership initiative where, they'll help with planning and engineering or whatever and share the costs with the town. The town is pursuing.
We're in the phase now of trying to get funding to essentially study what the conditions are and what's possible. So that's where that is. It's kind of I think it was the pre-engineering study is where we're at right now. So it's kind of early, but it's happening. And then I connected with Emily
Rabi?
Rab?
Rabi?
I didn't ask her how to pronounce her last name. But I spoke with her. She's from the Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission. And so I spoke with her on that. They are happy to help us and assist us in whatever capacity they can on that. During that conversation, it also came up the housing study that they did, which if you have not seen the report that they put together with Camoin, I believe is the consultant that they work with, very thorough, very informative. It's great. And that's obviously a very pressing issue. They are working on rolling out kind of a next step. Now they've done the study, how to address it and how to encourage and get housing built in anywhere in Lincoln County that is receptive, basically. I think Damerscott has started coordinating a meeting, like a presentation of that study to, I want to say their select board, because it wasn't their planning board as far as I know. But if we can, I'd love to try and piggyback on that. Maybe they'll do it twice, but that would be good. I don't know if the planning board here is interested in getting together and hearing that.
You're talking about Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission is doing the presentation
Mhm.
for Damerscott.
I believe so. I didn't get too many details on it, but if that's available, is that something we might be interested in?
I'd say keep us all in the loop, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Which kind of brings me to the next point. We discussed housing committee, and I wanted to take the next steps on actually getting that together. I'm doing the same thing in Damerscott. The one question is joint, separate, not at all. What do you think? My recommendation would be joint because it's basically one housing market, Damerscott and Newcastle. It obviously spills out into others, but I'm going between both. So if anybody's interested, it makes sense.
Realtor.
No,
Recommends
I just
joint?
agree with him. He is too.
Well, yes, but I mean, different perspectives here, right? I mean, if you agree.
Yeah.
You would know.
Um,
I mean, how do you all feel about having a joint or recommending a joint committee with Damerscott on housing? We had talked about reforming what was the Newcastle Housing Committee from last year as a subcommittee or an ad hoc committee of the planning board. And seeing if we could get people interested in, purpose to going and starting with this report in Lincoln County Regional Planning. But there's also so much happening right now in the world of housing. It's kind of crazy. There's a lot of grants. There's a lot of stuff floating around, and towns have to process it to stay on top of it.
how do you want to do it? Do you want to do like a formal recommendation to the select board to reconstitute that? I don't know. How was it done the last time? Does anybody remember?
So that's a great question. I mean, we have one joint committee with Damerscott, which is the Harbor Committee.
Mhm.
And I guess we have one joint committee with Nobleboro for the fish ladder. And I think that's it.
Shellfish, right? That's
Mm.
right.
Yeah,
Shellfish. Thank you.
Shellfish and Harbor have ordinances, they're like, formal
Yes.
with, legal behind them. I don't know about the fish ladder.
They're actually working to make that more official,
Okay.
that relationship. That's a 200+ year old relationship that's basically been a handshake agreement for 200+ years, which is kind of awesome. But,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question.
I'm also happy just to kind of talk to Kevin and maybe at the next select board meeting, just to suggest it to them. And if they, I guess it's up to the planning board if you want to do an official recommendation. Whatever. But I can also just talk with them and they can officially do it without a recommendation from the planning board. I think.
No, I think we can do it. I don't see why we couldn't do it. We're not, the proposal to create a joint housing committee with Damascotta would not encumber the town in any way.
No, I don't. No, I don't think a recommendation, like an official recommendation from the planning board, would do anything except, and maybe I would have to tell Kevin, yeah, that the town manager, the interim town manager.
Yes,
I think other than that, that's about where we go.
that's about it. I think we should do that.
Yeah, it carries a little more weight.
It does carry a little more weight. Should we talk about, let's make it a little bit more formal than that. Let's talk about composition, like how many members should there be on the committee? And should there be representatives from each of the planning boards or select boards, or let's actually like put some bounds on it real quick.
Mhm.
Any thoughts?
I think each planning board should send people or a person. I mean, that would probably be logical, right? And you'll be there, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's your capacity.
I would assume that would
Yeah.
make sense to me, but I don't make decisions.
Board of 7?
Yeah, I mean,
It's either 3 from Newcastle or 4 from Newcastle, vice versa from Damascotta. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm always hesitant on these joint committees about, how do you have equal representation with unequal numbers? Because committee should never be an even number of people.
that's a good point.
So it's nice to say, well, 2 or 3 people from Newcastle, 2 or 3 people from Damascotta makes a committee, but
Mhm.
if there's a contentious issue.
That annually or something.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, that's actually not a bad idea, right?
Mhm.
I mean, are we talking about, I think we're probably talking about committee that's gonna be active for a couple of years,
I don't think we're going to solve the housing
in a couple of meetings.
crisis, if I can say that. Yeah.
Shocked.
In short order, not to, put limits and under. But
You don't think
it's a
we
big
can do
issue? It's a
that?
big issue. So that's my only point.
So then let's make that recommendation then. That,
And
I'd be happier with maybe 3 from Newcastle and at least 3 from Newcastle,
Mhm.
3 from Damascotta, and a 4th from one town or the other that alternates on a yearly basis. That's a good suggestion.
Or 6 months. I mean, it doesn't matter what the time.
No,
frame
I
is.
don't think it matters. Year's fine. I mean,
Okay.
appointments to these committees that have to be
But-
done annually anyway.
yeah.
Right.
And I guess the recommendation is at least one person from each planning board.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And
We recommend that we invite someone. No, I wouldn't have to vote. If you know,
yeah, yes, I think that would be good. I will talk to Emily or
Yeah.
anybody at the Lincoln County Regional and see maybe just like a standing invitation for it. Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're busy.
And let's also suggest that we alternate meetings, one meeting in Newcastle, the next
Location.
meeting in Damascotta, location just changes so that everybody has, equal burden of driving
Or walking if
or
they're
walking.
in town. Okay. Well, locations and okay.
And I think, I think having it be a formal committee instead of just an ad hoc committee would be good. It could establish, bylaws. If it's going to run for at least a couple of years, establishing some ground rules in the first meeting would be advantageous.
It makes, I think that's appropriate. Select board members welcome on the committee as available, or do we want them on there? I imagine, not that you all aren't busy, but they're already meeting twice a month in both communities, so.
Yeah, I don't want to limit it. They have limits as to how many of them can be in a room at any given time anyway.
Right.
So.
Right.
I don't think it matters.
Well, it's true for,
That's true for us too, actually. We couldn't have 3 members of this board on
Yeah.
that committee.
the only other thing that I was thinking is, do you want to, like, what's the mission? They can define it more clearly, but to increase housing or consider housing options, I don't.
How about to establish that in the first meeting? Because I don't want to speak for anyone that may or may not be on that committee. I have ideas, but it's not my committee.
To establish a
Yeah,
purpose.
I think the recommendation should include, let's establish what the purpose of the committee is. Let's establish the bylaws and then go.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. Good. All right. If that's out, do we have a motion on that recommendation?
Sure, I do. Whatever we just said.
Do all that.
Yes.
Excellent. Do we have a second on that? Moved and seconded. Any further discussion about the motion? All right, all in favor? That passes 4-0. Thank you.
Okay, now I have nothing else. The next meeting is on the 21st. It's going to be a public hearing,
Yes,
as we've just discussed, and
so
that's it.
while we're on that topic, since we know that the number of folks who came out for the public information workshop for the committee, the ad hoc committee, it was like 40-something people at Lincoln. And we have time to advertise. Should we advertise that our meeting will be at Lincoln to accommodate a larger turnout? Should we have one? Because
Just in case.
just in case. Yeah, I don't think,
But
yeah,
check.
I don't think we want to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so hold it at Lincoln
Yeah.
if they
Yeah,
are willing to accommodate us.
I'll put in a request tomorrow for the 21st at 6:30 and see what room is available. And if the dining hall is available, great. If not, maybe we can get one of the other spaces.
Yeah.
Okay. But I just think that's probably wise. We may get 50 people.
Yeah.
Okay. All set?
That's all I've got.
All right, the time is 8:05 without objection. Meeting adjourned.